Dodge Billingsley entered Chechnya in fall of 1997 and became a guest of warlord Shamil Basayev, who now has a $10 million reward on his head as Russia's most wanted man. The reward is for information leading to the neutralization of Basayev and former Chechen separatist former Chechen president Aslan Mashadov. Billingsley will explore the role of Islamic militants, the role that they have played in Chechnya against Russia, which he says has added an entirely new dynamic since the polarizing events of 9/11, and certainly since the events of the recent school siege. Combat Films and Research has just completed Beyond the Border, which we announced a series of films and a panel discussion for the Kennedy Center that began airing tonight on KBYU Channel 11. In the fall of 2001, Billingsley spent several months working in Afghanistan close to the battle for Mazar-e-Sharif, documenting the experience with director Paul Ewell in a film titled The House of War. He was also one of only 2 foreigners on hand at the prison revolt that took the life of CIA agent Mike Spann. Billingsley returned to Afghanistan just months following the Mazar-e-Sharif uprising, this time with U.S. allied troops during Operation Anaconda, as chronicled in the film Close Combat Attack Apaches, D-Day Operation Anaconda. Having produced and directed documentaries on location from the United Arab Emirates to Africa and from Abkhazia to China, Billingsley continues to be involved in the conflicts plaguing the world. He received a bachelor's degree in history from Columbia University and a master's degree in war studies from London's King's College. Please join with me in welcoming Dodge Billingsley, who will be speaking on the Beslan School, Militant Islam Hijacks the Chechen Separatist Movement.
Fog and fiction. That's pretty interesting. It's good to be here today. Originally, we thought we'd talk about our series, but of course, since the Beslan school siege, it became timely again to bring up something that we had done in the past, and that was talk about Chechnya. And it's something that I've been working on for a while, is this, because in my mind, I look at the 2 Chechen conflicts, and the first war from 1994 to 1996 was very much a war of independence. There were Islamic overtones, there were glimpses of jihad, and there were mujahideen coming into Chechnya, but we're not talking a lot of mujahideen. We're just talking, handfuls, bunches. And there was a lot of fighting between them and the Chechens because they thought the Chechens weren't good Muslims, and the Chechens weren't really interested in praying 5 times a day, And so, but since then, there's been a steady evolution, and I think there's due to a lot of factors. And so, what I wanted to do first was show you a clip. I've got 4 clips from a film we made called Immortal Fortress, and the first one is, let's see which one we're going to show first. These are short clips, so let me get the screen up here. I'll tell you, as we're finding the button here, there's one on the hospital raid in Budenovsk, which was the first massive hostage operation or hostage-taking incident that the Chechens mastermind, I guess you'd say. I wanted to give you a glimpse of Shamil when I was with him in his home and just talk to him about life in Islam. And then we also have an interview with a woman named Maha, who could see, and it was foreshadowing. I mean, it was like, what's interesting about the film we made is in '99, when we came back and actually got it done, it wasn't that relevant. And now all of a sudden, you look back on it and you see this foreshadowing of this general Islamification of the Chechen movement. And so I wanted to go to Maha as well. And then a general thing about tactics in the war. In fact, let's go to tactics first and just sort of introduce. This is the little cutout of the film, basically from the first war, 1994-96, and primarily the assault on Grozny at the beginning of the war. So we're going to run that for a second. Can you guys see?
It took days for the impact of the New Year's Eve 1994 assault to be understood. But it gradually became obvious that Russian soldiers had been routed, largely because of their own mistakes. Tactical errors like failing to deploy dismounted infantry were magnified by a general lack of preparation.
Значит, русские шли, не соблюдая вообще каких бы то ни было канонов ведения боя. Дистанция между броней была порядка 3-5 метров. Вообще дико. Все они были пьяные в стельку. И, насколько я помню, ни старшие офицеры, ни солдаты, ни среднее звено, они практически не осознавали, что происходит в первый день.
The Chechens, much poorer in weapons and fewer in number, were able to make the most of their resources. Their basic tactic was to use mobile units of 10 to 12 men, each group being armed with one grenade launcher, 2 sniper rifles, and the rest with automatic weapons, if they could get them. Sometimes referred to as hunter-killer groups, these units were under the complete control of their commanders and often decided their own objectives.
Мы постоянно находились в движении, и это, в общем-то, довольно значительно осложняло русским, которые пытались вести войну по описанному.
The Chechens had a huge advantage in their familiarity with the city. It was not uncommon for Chechens to pass between fixed Russian positions that were only meters apart. This was disastrous for the Russians. Chechen hunter-killer groups would maneuver between Russian positions and fire a couple of shots in one direction and then the other. Believing they were under attack, Russian units would shoot at each other, sometimes for hours.
И только лишь когда они вызывали, и те, и другие вызывали авиацию, они, в общем-то, или артиллерию, они начинали понимать, что они бьют по-своему. Образно можно сравнить, если бы в яму, где находятся голодные волки, которых не кормили где-то дней 7, бросить кусок мяса, буквально такая фильма очень. Ну, я вам скажу, что в условиях динамичных городских боев человек буквально за 2-3 дня тут же превращался в профессионального солдата. Потому что все это было очень быстро и очень спрессовано.
Okay. I wanted to just bring that up just to sort of take us back to the first war, 1994, 1995, and the general movement that went on. Someone who emerged out of that whole thing, how do I turn this thing on? Out of this entire, I don't know how to work any of these things, unfortunately. One of the persons or one of the warlords to emerge in the first war was Shamil Basayev. And no one has actually probably became as famous as him. And so I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a bio on Shamil. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a big movement for this, what they call the Confederation of Mountain Peoples of the Caucasus. And I heard a lot about it when I was in the Georgian Republic in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, places like that, because you would see these freedom fighters coming in. And the reports, it was very confusing in the press because they would say Soviet or ex-Soviet Russian nationals were fighting the wars in Abkhazia and the wars in South Ossetia. But what it really was it wasn't so much regular Russian Federation troops. It was a lot of people like a lot of Chechens and a lot of Dagestanis and Ingusetians from North Ossetia, a lot of North Ossetians from Vladikavkaz and those areas. And they teamed up in this movement for this Confederation of Mountain Peoples Republic, which idealized this sort of mountain nation that would stretch from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, ideally from Sochi, Russia, to possibly Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan, the regional capital there. It wasn't, I remember reading the press, it was kind of weird. I mean, the press on it was very mixed. It was like, well, what is it? Is it real? Is it a front for a KGB organization or whatever? But, and even today I think that's a little bit debated, but the real fact of the matter is that it produced a lot of fighters to go to these areas in the southern Caucasus. One of them was Shamil Basayev. He took a battalion to Abkhazia for the war there in 1992 and 1993. Shamil Basayev led the 1st Chechen battalion, and then there was another battalion under the command of Ruslan Galayev. And those two field commanders basically took over the Abkhaz independence movement, and I'm not sure why. In fact, Shamil won the Hero of Abkhazia medal, which is probably the equivalent of the Medal of Honor here, or that's what they treat it like. And within a matter of months, he was basically running the show in Abkhazia. And again, the Georgians were saying this is Russia's, we're fighting Russians. But the funny part was the Chechens fighting in Abkhazia were pragmatic enough to use the access they gained across the border, you know, because the Russians weren't stopping them crossing the borders through the mountains. They didn't like the Russians at all, but at the same time, they were probably fulfilling Russia's purposes because, you know, if you know anything about Abkhazia, Russia wanted those Black Sea bases. They had an Air Force base there. They wanted that area. So they had no problem with all these freelancers fighting in the name of the Confederation of Mountain Peoples of the Caucasus to free Abkhazia from Georgia. The short end of that is Shamil and Basayev and Galayev. They received, that's where they kind of first went to war. In 1993, when the war ended there, the Abkhaz were victorious, and it's still now a separatist state within the Georgian Republic. The the Chechens went home. I talked to them about this period, and Shamil said basically we were kind of preparing for a confrontation with Russia. We weren't sure if we were going to have one, but you know there was an attempt at a coup. There was some covert activity. Russian federal forces tried to remove Dzhokhar Dudayev, at the time president of Chechnya. They were unable to remove him. And then, of course, in 1994, New Year's Eve, they attacked the Chechen capital of Grozny, which that clip that I just showed you is Ilyas Akhmadov, who was the foreign minister of Chechnya for a time, and he was actually like the Shamil's lieutenant. He was sort of like Shamil's chief of staff. Actually, it's interesting, Ilyas Akhmadov has just been granted political asylum here in the United States through the Carnegie Endowment for Democracy, I believe, and the Russian press was they were pretty livid about this I think it was about a month ago, and they said, you know, the U.S. treats things in Chechnya, what's good for the, Russia, what's good for the U.S., what's bad for Russia is good for the U.S. They were very disappointed that we didn't turn over Ilyas to the Russian authorities. Anyway, the first war, as you may recall, the Russians eventually were able to seize Grozny. In fact, the head of the Grozny garrison was Shamil Basayev. He is famous for leading the garrison out of Grozny in, I think, January or February of 1995 with a stick in his hand. And when I was there talking to all the Chechens, they always called him Moses because he led the garrison out of Grozny walking with his staff. And so they referred to him as Moses, which I thought was very interesting. They went into the mountains, and I don't know, I didn't bring a map with me, but basically you have the city, and then you have some plains, and you have the mountains and the North Caucasus. Chechens told me, and even some Russian soldiers who were there said that in Grozny, the Chechens always had the upper hand. They knew the city well, they used the sewers, they just fought a truly three-dimensional war. In the plains, however, the Chechens suffered because in the plains you have longer distances for your fields of fire. You could bring your tank and your heavy armor and your helicopters to bear. You could take out Chechen targets at 2,000 meters. Well, Chechens would have to crawl up to 200 meters to be effective with an RPG. So they had tremendous losses in the plains, and so they gave up the plains and went into the mountains. And then when the Russians pursued the Chechens into the mountains, they gained the upper hand again. And I have to say, going through the mountains every single turn or curve in the mountains had a destroyed or tipped over or blown up Russian tank. It was just unbelievable how much Russian armor was destroyed up there in the mountains. So you got the sense that they really did have the upper hand in the mountains. 1996 to 1999 is the interwar period. That's when we went in. It's interesting. We tried to go in and go into Chechnya before the war even was closed in September of 1996, but it took so long to get in. At the time, there was hostage taking for ransom was huge business, and so most of the Westerners that were going in there, the handful that were trying to go in there, were getting kidnapped or killed. I don't know if you remember Fred Cooney. I think he was associated with the Soros Foundation, disappeared, and eventually I think they found his head in a gunny sack, and then there was the 4 British Telecom, and they found their heads in a gunny sack. And so it was really a tough place to go. So my theory was, you can't go into Chechnya unless you go in with like the baddest guy on the block, because that's the only way to be protected. Because, yes, the Russians would be after Chechen units perhaps, but no random Chechen would take us hostage or kill us if we were with Shamil. And that strategy actually did prove it worked. It actually worked. But it took a long time to get the word to Shamil. And I used contacts I had met in Abkhazia, Chechen fighters that served under him, to sort of pass the word that we wanted to do this story in Chechnya. But we also didn't want to get kidnapped and didn't want to end up in a gunny sack, so we needed to go with, you needed some sort of security. which became a very interesting issue because there's a lesson in objectivity there, which I've struggled with ever since covering war. And we talked about this last semester and the semesters past covering wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, if you want to report the news from a bureau station or a hotel rooftop, you can pretty much say whatever you want to say. But, you know, I only saw one side of the story there, and that was Shamil's camp. And it was purely for security reasons. I didn't have the flexibility. You just can't run around Chechnya on your own. You can't sit on the 50-yard line and report the news and then just go back and feed it. I mean, places like Chechnya are really, really bad. In fact, it's the worst place that I've ever been, hands down, hands down. Anyway, what happened during the interwar period was interesting. When we arrived in Shamil's home up in Vidino, and we met his father and his uncle and different people, we also met some Arabs, and they belonged to the Mujahideen battalions under the command of an Arab named Khattab. Now, Khattab wouldn't speak to me because I was American, in fact, and then he told our guards that we should be killed because we were American. And Shamil just kind of shrugged it off and said, yeah, whatever. And but what's interesting is they were operating in the Vidino Rayon with Shamil. And it turned out that they had a little nerve center there, and they had, I think, about 6 Muslims running the computer center, and they were all ex-British military. They were all British citizens with who either converted to Islam or maybe that was, you know, their traditional roots. I'm not sure, but they were running the nerve center there for the Mujahideen battalion. And when I say battalion, a battalion in Chechnya normally ran about 80 instead of, you know, 800, you know, or like a company in the U.S. military, maybe around 200. These are whole battalions, but they were usually around 80 to 100 people. At the same time, there was also, to balance the Islamic Mujahideen, the battalion there, and there was 2, there was a Ukrainian nationalist battalion who dressed in black, looked very Nazi. It was, and they only had one agenda, and that was to kill Russians. And so they were there next to the Islamic Mujahideen Brigade, and they had their Christian cross. And it was very bizarre at the time. And so, in some way, the war in Chechnya was kind of a lot of people that had grudges against Russian Federal or former Soviet went in to fight in Chechnya as volunteers. Just as we saw in Abkhazia, a lot of people had grudges on both sides of that conflict filtered in there. There were Turks, there were Jordanians, there was a lot of people flowing in. Also during that period, Shamil ran for president of Chechnya, independent Chechnya or autonomous Chechnya, and he was beaten by Aslan Maskadov, who became the president and who is now still, if there is a Chechnya to be president of it, he was the last president. He's still alive. And in 1999, though, however, things really started to shift. And actually, let me back up. In 1998, the first suicide bombings in Chechnya occurred that I can think of. And I remember it was a big news for a while in the press. Are they going to go to this Palestinian model? And it just kind of disappeared. There was 2 or 3 incidents, strapped the bombs to them, went in, blew themselves up. And that was it. It kind of faded away. They didn't do it anymore. And but what did happen in 1999, Shamil and Khattab, those 2 groups, invaded into neighboring Dagestan, into a bunch of the mountain villages there, and proclaimed an independent Islamic Republic of Dagestan. And at the same time, Shamil is implicated in these apartment bombings in Russia, which nowadays I think most people totally discredit that. They know that it wasn't Shamil and the Chechens, and they said flat out it wasn't. What I've always found interesting about the Chechens is they're usually pretty straight up. If they did it, they'll tell you they did it because it's kind of a thing for them. But either way, that was probably justification enough for Moscow to invade or to try to take the war back into Chechnya to sort of solve this problem once and for all. In 2000, again, the same thing happened. The Russians attacked Grozny, but this time it was a much different story. It was very heavy. They'd send units into Grozny. If they would take sniper fire or RPG fire from a quadrant, they'd back the group out, and they basically obliterate the block or the quadrant with airstrikes and artillery, which led to even more, what they say, human rights abuses. But, human rights in Chechnya, that's, anyway. But, or in war in general, but in this, again, I think it was February, maybe in January, I can't remember now. I was trying to look it up. I honestly don't remember which month it was. Shamil tried to do the same exact thing where he was going to lead the Grozny garrison out of Grozny. Well, this time, they were given what they had done apparently in the first war is they had paid off corrupt Russian commanders to receive a corridor. They'd go out this corridor, and they were able to go out and go into the mountains and live to fight another day. In this case, they did the same thing again, but they were double-crossed by the Russians, or it was a ruse by the Russians. And when they got into the corridor, they were hit by artillery, and they lost 500 soldiers and 16 senior field commanders. And that, to me, was the death blow for the Chechen independence movement, because all the senior leadership basically was wiped out trying to get out of Grozny that day. Shamil's lucky to get out. He lost a foot. And like I say, 500 key fighters didn't make it, and the fighters that did said it was just, they had to just jump from on top of body parts to avoid, because basically they let them into a minefield, and they bombed, hit them with artillery, and hardly anybody got out. The attrition rate in the Chechen armed forces is tremendous. When I was there in the interwar period, what was interesting is once a week, we'd go to the banya, which is a steam bath, basically to take a bath. And as everybody stripped down, I could not believe the wounds on everybody. Nobody was left unscathed. I mean, just chunks of like the arm gone, chunks of the buttocks gone. I mean, everybody had huge, massive scars, and everybody was hit. They had a very deep respect for Russian firepower, and it took a toll. So, in 2002, it gets really interesting. Khatab, and I guess I could have put a lot more things in this. By 2000, they started using the Georgian Pankisi Valley as a point of refuge and a point to gather Islamic fighters. Georgia, under the Shevardnadze government, just didn't have very much control over parts of Georgia outside of Tbilisi. They lost Abkhazia, they lost South Ossetia. Aslan Abashidze was the dictator of a little region called Adjara on the Black Sea, and he just left a month or two ago, but they had no control of Adjara, and they had no control in the Armenian sections, just like, I'm not kidding, 30 miles south of Tbilisi. They had very little control. They also had no control in the Pankisi Valley. What they did do is they set up Georgian border guards or armed soldiers around the Pankisi. I don't know if it's to keep the Chechens in or to keep people out, but it was, you can get in there. We all got in there. Everybody who really wanted to go to Pankisi could still go to Pankisi, including a bunch of foreign mujahideen who were using that as a staging ground. And at the time, there was a lot of talk Russia wanted to escalate operations into Georgian territory, and Shevardnadze was really trying. They didn't want Russian operations in Georgia, and they didn't want to team up with the Russians because Georgia was in a pickle in this, because Chechnya is a pretty fearsome enemy, and they're just north, and they've got a bunch of fighters in the Pankisi Valley, 60, 70 miles from Tbilisi, the capital. So anyway, it was just basically back and forth. No, there's no Chechens. Yes, there are. No, there are, back and forth denials. Well, basically, I tried to find a commander I'd always wanted to do some work with, and that, Ruslan Galayev, the other original Chechen commander who had fought in Abkhazia like a decade earlier. So we were trying to find him in Pankisi in 2000. We could not find him, and I was so frustrated. And I'm like, whatever, So I went back, and I was at the hotel, and these Georgian friends of mine came up, and they go, you wouldn't believe what happened to us. We were bear hunting, and we ran into Galayev's group, and we thought we were dead because there's 80, 90 Chechen soldiers. But after they realized we were just bear hunting, we just had some kebabs and chilled out for a day or two, and we came back to Tbilisi, and they went back into the North Caucasus. So they definitely, we're using Georgia as a staging ground. Meanwhile, there were a lot of things that worked too, because to try to get a measure of this foreign influence in Chechnya. And one thing the Russians did, they were able to infiltrate Khatab's mujahideen and poison him with a double agent. Now, the rumor is that Aslan Maskhadov, the president of Chechnya, who's also living in the mountains, helped the Russian FSB poison Khatab, because even though the Chechens showed a unified front against Russia, in the interwar period, it was highlighted by fighting amongst themselves. While we were there, a commander by the name of Salman Raduyev got into a gun battle in downtown Grozny because President Maskhadov, who ran the TV station, would not play one of his commercials. And it was a full-on firefight. It lasted 6 or 7 hours. I have no idea how many people died. I just remember that we were trying to get out of the corridor where all the firing was going on. And these groups would fight against each other all the time. And then the Arabs or the Mujahideen would come in and mix it up even a little bit more. So the rumor is that Maskhadov, being a moderate Chechen, dedicated independence, helped the FSB, Russian security services, eliminate Khatab. It's really hard to say. There's so much hearsay in Chechnya. You know, you just never know. You can't sort it out. At the same time, Shamil kind of reemerges from his war wounds and starts this, apparently this Garden for the Righteous Islamic Brigade of Martyrs. And after 2002, you start to see some more of the suicide attacks start to become more prevalent. And I have a couple of thoughts on this. One is that it's a region of despair. I mean, the entire region is shattered. I mean, what you have, like, during the First War, there were women fighters, but most of the women fighters that I interviewed from the First War carried supplies. They were sort of like support troops. You know, now you have women strapping bombs to them, you know. And I don't know if it's part of an overall movement. I would say, though, that when most of all the males in your family are wiped out and you live in a refugee camp in Ingushetia or Dagestan, I mean, some people, I'm sure, will just say, well, why not? You know, why not? I'm easily you can recruit me. It's hard to say. But now, of course, and then we have the Moscow theater raid, which was led by yet another clan, the Basayev clan, Mosavar Basayev. Now, Shamil, it's interesting, if you look at the Russian press, there were some notes saying that Shamil was in charge of that, or it came out, I think, in some of the Islamic websites, but then the Russians went after Moskadov, because they thought, and I don't know why, but what's interesting about the Basayevs is that they operated fairly independently. I'll just read you a little blurb on the Basayevs. They were very interesting groups. For years, the Basayevs have been a malign force in Chechen affairs. Family leader Arbi Basayev was a rogue warlord and a bandit rather than a rebel who made millions through smuggling, kidnappings, and contract killings. And that's true. When I went to Chechnya in 1996, one of my main objectives was just to avoid Basayevs. And I didn't go to their area of Chechnya because they had a reputation for kidnapping basically anybody, cutting off an ear or finger, sending it home, and extorting money from your family or your company, that sort of thing. In 1998, he tried to take over Gudermes in eastern Chechnya on the Dagestani border, near the Dagestani border. And Moskadov had to go in, and basically there was a big battle between Basayev's clan and Moskadov's to take Basayev out of Gudermes. And he was stripped within his rank. He was stripped of his rank, and he was issued a formal arrest warrant, and earning Basayev the distinction of being wanted by both sides, the Chechens and the Russians. He was responsible for the kidnapping of the 4 British telecommunications workers, the heads they found in the gunny sack, and 3 British, 1 New Zealander, and had also apparently, and this is Russian FSB sources, they say he took 20 million from Al-Qaeda. No idea about that. What's interesting is the FSB, Russian Security Services, quote said, Basayev's true ideology was always Basayev. He was in it for himself. But what I also thought was interesting is I saw a few times the press where Basayev and Basayev's names kept getting mixed up, because Basayev had sort of been Moscow's most wanted for a decade, and there was this confusion. Now we have Beslan, which makes everything kind of relevant again. And there's 4 major... The Chechens, you could argue they have a dual-track or a twin-track policy. They have military operations, which they do quite regularly. But, you kill a couple guys at a checkpoint, you down a helicopter. In fact, and then they have what they've called these big hostage or sieges and into Russian territory. And there's been 4. The first one was in June of 1995 in the Budnovsk, and that was run by Shamil Basayev. And the backstory on that is he left for Russia a week after they seized his little area, the Vedino Rayon, was where his family, his clan was based. Russians overran it in May of 1995. He lost 11 family members. And a week later, he organized this raid. President Dudayev, Jokhar Dudayev, said he condemned the raid. I mean, when they found that it was happening, and while they were in there, I think they were there for as much as a week trying to negotiate and whatever. They took anywhere from 1,000 to 1,700 hostages in the city, rounded them up, took them into a hospital. The numbers have been inflated, and I've noticed they've grown. And when it was over, they said there was something like 30, 40 dead, 50, 60 wounded. Now I see numbers as high as 170 dead. So I'm not really sure how many were dead, but what was interesting about it is that Shamil was able to negotiate a way out, negotiate a ceasefire for Chechnya, and get him and his men out. they had volunteers, even from the hospital, they had volunteers when they were hostages. I mean, there were people volunteered to go back and accompany them on the buses as human shields, and there was a lot of fighting between Russians on the street. It made the press until NTV pulled it, where you could argue that they, you know, they have the Stockholm syndrome. They were like, they become friendly with their kidnappers, but there was no real. It was just a different feeling. It was a different time. That's all. You know, it's interesting. You could do a whole study on it. But it was interesting. He came back, and most Chechens credit the victory in the first war to this raid, because what it did is it gave them a ceasefire. And all the Chechen field commanders, basically, that I talked to, and the ones that have done anything in writing and other interviews I've seen, they said that raid gave them breathing space. When all looked like it was lost, all of a sudden the Russians did a ceasefire. They had lost Vidino. At the time, they had 17 field commanders that split Chechnya up in like a fan from east to west or west to east. But at the time, they had eliminated so many of the Chechen pockets that they had basically Moskatov and Dudayev took the western half, Moskatov took the eastern half, and that was it. And they had no communications, and the Russians had infiltrated all the way up into all the mountain areas. But this gave the Chechens breathing space. And Shamil came home a hero, and President Dudayev had to extract his condemnation of the raid because Shamil bailed Chechnya out. So in January of '96, you had a copycat raid by Shamil Raduyev, who married President. I know these names are crazy. President Duduyev's niece. So he was now sort of married into the president's family. He came up with the idea to do a raid or to conduct a raid onto a helicopter base in Kizlar helicopter base. Well, and they were going to blow up these helicopters and this and that. Well, they went to Kizlar, did it. There wasn't much going on. They took some hostages, and they got as far as Pirvomayska, right in Dagestan, near the Chechen border. And the Russians this time said, no way, we're not letting them get in. And they blocked them, and there was a battle, lasted a few days. A number of the hostages were killed. I mean, I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of hostages were killed, and I think 90 Chechens were killed. During the raid, Shamil Raduyev suffers from like a breakdown, and he hands over command to Hunkar Pasha, who was another really famous Chechen warlord who also died in the Moscow retreat in 2000, later in 2000. But anyway, nothing was really accomplished by it. It was condemned by all the Chechen warlords, but it had the backing of the president at that time. So then you have this period where they, 6 months later, they gain independence. And then all of a sudden now, with the war, you have Mosvar Barayev leading the theater raid. Now, he was the nephew, again, of Arbi Barayev, who was this notorious kidnapper. And the Barayevs and Basayevs hated each other, and they often got into it. However, the Russians had implicated both Moskatov and Basayev. It's hard to say if they had anything to do with it or not, despite Islamic militant websites, despite letters, despite FSB intelligence. But I'm not really sure it matters. The point, I'm going to try to make a point with this, and then we'll show a clip and answer questions because we're rambling forever. Now you have Beslan, and again, now Shamil's come out and said that he did it, I guess, yesterday. I think he finally came out and said that he's responsible. And it's a militant Islamic website said he was responsible, I think, weeks ago. And Russia's put this $10 million bounty. The question I guess I want to ask is, the Chechen command infrastructure is it's very free thinking. It's very independent. It's like the clip in the movie. I believe it still stays the same. I guess maybe the more important question is, if you neutralize Basayev and Aslan Moskatov, do you end the problems in Chechnya? Absolutely not. There's no way that, if Mosvar Barayev can go up to Moscow and do his own raid, and he's like the nephew of one of the kingpins, I mean, there are enough Chechen freelancers, I guess, that are more than willing to take the war to Russia. So I don't think eliminating Basayev or Moskatov will do. But it's a figurehead kind of thing. It's almost like the U.S. wanting to go get Osama bin Laden. I mean, I don't think anybody in the room thinks if you get Osama that's it. Everything goes to terrorist level green, and it's all over. And the same goes in Chechnya. Basayev and Moskatov are the only two field commanders left alive from 1994. That's it. They're the only two. Everybody else has been killed. Everybody who's now in the Chechen ranks is new, or they've been supplanted. They're new to Chechen. They may not even be Chechens. And so because of that, the Chechen struggle will probably not end, and is instead taken on a real tone of an Islamic holy war for a couple of reasons. One, again, most of the Chechens are dead. All the field commanders are dead now except Basayev and Moskatov. Basayev has played the Islamic card while Moskatov has remained fairly secular. And again, Russian press goes back and forth on this, and Intel goes back and forth. Are they playing good cop, bad cop? Is Moskatov really, But everybody believes, I think, that if push comes to shove, there's no way Moskatov could really get Basayev to do anything. Basayev acts independently. He may, and so does Moskatov. And the chances are so do the Barayevs, and so do the others. So I think this general evolution, I know I've really talked a lot and thrown out a ton of names. Do you want to show another clip? I'm going to show you a clip of Shamil, just an interview, and then we'll open it up to questions. Because I guess I showed up late too, didn't I? I'm sorry it's subtitled, and and the screen's kind of low. Let's go to, go to Shamil.
Я был верующим, и это помешало мне стать коммунистом. А так я очень верил в идеалы коммунизма, потому что каждая книга, которую читаешь, там лучший человек, коммунист самый честный, коммунист самый умный, самый храбрый, самый принципиальный везде коммунист. Кино смотришь, коммунист, радио слушаешь, коммунист. Даже вот у меня отец, дядя, они слушали радио «Свобода», там я даже ими был недоволен. Вот, думаю, не заблудшие, что они слушают.
Despite these communist leanings, the dream of independence from Russia was always dear to Shamil. It was during Perestroika, when all the old views on life were changing, that he saw an opportunity for making this dream reality.
На жизнь по-другому начали смотреть, и такая бездуховность, такая пропасть, она так открытой раной была вообще у всего советского народа. И вот в этой ситуации уже люди начали возвращаться к истокам, искать самих себя. И себя я нашел именно в жизни своего народа, стремления своего народа.
Many have filled this gaping hole by turning back to Islam, the religion of their forefathers.
Против русских воевать нам было удовольствие, потому что мы стоим на верном пути Аллаха.
Умереть на пути Аллаха для нас высшая мечта.
Ислам не может играть какую-то роль в жизни, когда сама жизнь это и есть ислам.
Just a sort of a glimpse of that interview with Shamil. So there's a couple more clips I can show you. They're small, but it is 1:45. Any questions or comments at all? Because we could open it up. It rambled a lot. Hey, Adam.
I just have a question for you about putting the shift from the First War to the Second War in terms of a struggle for independence to a sort of a pan-Islamic struggle. If you could put that in the historical context of Chechnya, I mean, it seems as though this back and forth between just wanting the Russians out and wanting to sort of create an Islamic state and follow Sharia laws dates back quite a long way, at least to the first Shamil, and I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I think that, Imam Shamil, they tried to do this, was the 1800s, I think, or 1700s, 1800s. You know, I do believe that the Chechens still want independence. I mean, it seems like every time the Russians or Soviet Empire was weak, Chechens have always made a break for it. I think Stalin had to send 2 divisions into Chechnya, I think in the 30s or late 20s to put down a very small rebellion, but I think 2 entire divisions had to go into Grozny and crush this rebellion. So it wasn't surprising they declared independence probably in 91, also in the sense that everybody else along the Soviet periphery did as well. But what's interesting is that they were Muslim, and but you talk to some of the elders, like during the interwar period, there's a lot of breaks. A lot of the Islamic clerics that were there, and a couple that we talked to, were clearly not happy with the foreigners' brand of Islam, the Wahhabism that was coming in, because it wasn't a tradition of Islam practiced by the Chechens. But there was a shift, from more, I don't know if it's a more fundamentalist, but just a different brand of Islam. I still think the Chechens do want independence, but I also think that there's a lot of people who have run to the cause to make it an Islamic cause. I mean, when I was in the United Arab Emirates a few years ago, between the interwar years, I talked to some of the people in the UAE armed forces and stuff, and they talked about supporting Chechnya, and they thought that they were one of the primary funders of the first war, which we kind of see this pattern among the sort of pan-Islamic, these militant movements. But in Chechnya, you could argue they're very pragmatic. The Chechens are like, well, we're not going to get any support from anybody else. We don't need weapons. We can buy them from the Russians, which they've always bought the Russians weapons right off them and then used them against them the next day. They just needed money, and the Middle East brought a lot of money. The other thing is, when I was in Afghanistan, I was looking for Chechens, even when the Fortress massacre was over, or the Fortress battle where Span was killed and John Walker emerged. We went among all the dead, and there were hundreds and hundreds of dead on this battlefield. And I was looking to see if I could identify anybody as Chechens or whatever, because the rumor was all these Chechens in Afghanistan. And I think that's been a little misleading. I think that the Chechens have been the recipient of Islamic support rather than the Chechens I don't think they've gone so pan out. They're in it for themselves kind of thing. That's kind of how I saw it. I don't know. Yeah.
What is in it for Russia to keep Chechen from being independent? Why is this war worth it to them?
Oh, I don't know. Well, geographically, it's on the north slope of the Caucasus Mountains. If it was on the south slope, they probably wouldn't care, because frankly, they say we have a natural geographic border. Let them go. We can still play our games in there, but we can let them go. But if you're in the north slope, all you do is you stretch right, you lead and you go right down into the heartland of Russia. I mean, as you go north, there's nothing stopping you. And I don't know, it's been part of Russia, Soviet doctrine for a while. They didn't, they said earlier, I think it was during the Afghan period, they would not tolerate any fundamentalist Islamic states on their southern border. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a fear of that kind of growth going north. It's territorial integrity, most countries aren't going to let a part of their country go, and they consider it their country because they basically colonized it, I guess, in the 1700s. I don't know. It'd be hard for a lot of countries to let parts go that they now consider theirs. But I do think it would be easier if the Chechens were on the other side of the Caucasus, because you could still have influence there. You could still run your spy networks. You could still do whatever you were going to do, but you wouldn't be facing them right there. That's just one thought. I don't know. That's probably not a good answer, but countries, the thing is, the first war was really interesting because you have two issues: territorial integrity and self-determination, and both are guaranteed by international law. But they both are at odds with each other. The Chechens want to self-determine their own future. They're represented in Organization of Unrepresented Peoples at The Hague. They lobby for this nonstop, and they had a fairly. I guess the thing is, it was seen as a more legitimate cause then, I think, for a lot of people, because it was seen more as an an independence movement. Now I think they've kind of, since 9/11, the world shifted too. We see things in a different light, and there's a lot of talk that we sort of let Russia have more of a free hand in Chechnya for support in the war in Iraq, and that may be very well the case. So it's hard to say.
This is a personal question. What kind of thing drives you to go after a story like this?
Chechnya was just something I've always wanted to do, because when I was in Abkhazia, well, I'll tell you why, frankly, because when I was in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, everybody talked about Shamil Basayev and the Chechens, and they were just like the warriors of the Caucasus, and it was a bit intriguing. And then I also heard things like, I was in Vladikavkaz, and some South Ossetian guys who said, "Oh, well, I fought for Shamil in Abkhazia. He can't be killed, right?" I'm like, "No, I don't know. What do you mean?" Because he cannot be killed. And he had sort of kind of reached demigod status. And I was intrigued with this whole thing. And since I had bounced around the South Caucasus so much anyway, it just seemed like a natural progression to go north. But it was a much harder trip than I thought it was going to be. I was thrown in jail twice. We got chased by kidnappers out of Dagestan. I spent 2 months getting in and out. No time in Chechnya, just getting in and out. It was a really rough trip. And I don't know if I'd ever go back. It's too hard. In 2000, I tried to go back, and I got on the border, and I was looking at all the Russian positions to try to figure out if there was a way to cross. Just because when I went illegally. There was no real way to go into Chechnya, so you just go over the mountains and drop in. So what happened was the Russians grabbed us when we came out, and because I didn't have any visas or anything like that showed I was even in Russia, yet I was at a restaurant in Vladikavkaz. I was in, they kind of got us. But it was a tough trip to go. And you can go to Chechnya now and go into Grozny and go on the Russian press junket, but if you really want to have a glimpse at what's going on with the fighters, that's a whole other story. It's really difficult. A friend of mine went into Chechnya, but he was killed in a British guy, Roddy Scott, and he went in with Goliath's group. I went off to Afghanistan. He went in the next summer, and he called me and goes, "Hey, we're going in." And I said, "You know what? I'm doing Afghanistan. I can't get in this. I can't go now." And I said, "What's your exit strategy?" He goes, "I don't know. We'll climb over the mountains, and I'll just go out when they go out." I said, "That could be 9 months. If they get snowed in, they go. You could be living in the caves for 9 months." He goes, "Yeah, I know." And they were in some firefights in Ingushetia, and he just was killed in one of the firefights. He showed up, British nationals, Roddy Scott. So, because you can't, once you're in with the Chechens, it's not like you can just go over, "Hey, I'm an American, let me out." Oh, here's, the Russians, because I think he tried to surrender. The locals said he tried to surrender to the Russians just to get, because he just had enough of it. And they shot him. They just shot him. So I haven't been back. Because I wouldn't even know how to get to Shamil and those guys. Again, since 9/11, it's another world for me. Since I'm an American, I'm on the other side of the fence now. If he's cozied up to his militant Islam, the U.S. has kind of gone the other direction. So it's a much tougher situation.
Yeah. With the more aggressive kind of restructuring of regional governments by Vladimir Putin, how is that going to play out with the Chechens? What do you think is going to happen now?
Nothing. I mean, that's going to continue, I think. A lot of groups were offered autonomy, and what's interesting about Chechnya in the period 91 to 94, they did not want autonomy. They wanted independence. You alluded to it, Adam, a little bit earlier. I mean, they've always had a tendency of wanting to break free and to be free. I don't know. So I don't think any of the restructuring of the government. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the Putin government's really interesting. They killed that Chechen, what was his name? They killed him in Qatar like 8 months ago. They just went and assassinated him. And that Qataris grabbed the FSB guys. There's like the long arm of the Putin government going around taking care of the Chechnya loose ends, but they still can't get these guys in the mountains. I mean, to me, it's amazing that Basayev and Moskatov could still survive. There's not that much territory, for one thing. But until you take, I don't know if you can wipe out the movement. And there's probably only, I think it's fair to say, if there's 3,000 Chechen fighters in the mountains, that's max. It's just not that big a movement. But you have a lot of strong breeding ground in the refugee camps and stuff like that. So I just don't think that any sort of, plus the country's completely destroyed. I mean, journalist friends of mine, I didn't go to Sarajevo. Journalist friends of mine who went to Sarajevo, when they got to Grozny, they could not believe it. They said Sarajevo looks like a park, and Sarajevo looks terrible. And we saw a lot of that in the news, and in Grozny, there's just nothing in Grozny. It's completely destroyed, and all the villages are completely destroyed. I met a Russian tank manufacturer, Ukrainian actually, and he was contracted by the Russians to pull out destroyed armor and see if they could, I don't know what they were doing with it. He said, "Man, we're pulling out thousands of pieces of armor, like BMPs, BTRs, Tunguskas, everything." I mean, the actual count, I'd love to know what the actual count, what the Russians have lost. I mean, it's a pretty serious place. The thing about the raids, too, is, it seems like every 4 or 5 months, the Chechens will shoot down a Russian helicopter with 80 or 90 soldiers on it. So there's still a constant body count coming out of there. So I don't know if restructuring, I don't know if any of that political maneuver in any which way will help at all. Yeah.
What do you think Beslan means about how Shamil has changed, or what direction he's heading in now?
Well, now this is interesting. It takes us to our film tonight, Fog and Friction. The idea that things happen. The interesting thing about Beslan was they say it's because the bomb that was strapped to the ceiling fell off and detonated, which now it could only end bad if you take a school hostage, right? I mean, it could only end bad. That's the other thing I didn't put up in my chart. If you look at the 4 hostage operations and look at the 4 Russian responses, attack, 3 attacks in the Budanov school before they gave up and let Shamil go. They attacked and wiped out most of the Russians in Pervomaisk. Moscow, the theater, of course, they gassed and attacked and gassed. You know what happened there. And in Beslan, they attacked. So if you are Chechen and you go into that plan, you go into a school, you know it's only going to end bad. You can't even say, "Oh, I had no intention of killing kids. The Russians killed the kids." But ironically, or what's so silly about it, is that they say it started because the bomb fell off the ceiling, hit the ground, blew up amongst all the children who sit in the gymnasium. The Russians thought, oh, it's on, and they went in and attacked, and then in the whole melee, everybody, 350 people get killed. It's hard to say. I mean, if Shamil's really into it and those guys are into it, I think, sympathy levels would go way down if he had any. Even the Arab press right afterwards, said it was just awful, So, it's hard to say. But again, you're in a society of despair, too. I mean, the fact they can find women to strap, to become suicide bombers was unheard of in Chechnya 5 years ago. But most Chechens, from 11 to 60 males have been let off to these filtration camps, probably tortured beyond belief, and most of them don't come out of it. And there's just, it's a really bad place. I don't know. It's not going to do Shamil any good. But I guess the big thing is, if they were able to catch Shamil, I don't think it would be the end of these kind of things. That's I think what I would like to say. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first has to do with this person who was given asylum recently, and Putin and the Russian leaders took great exception to that.
Yes.
Could you comment on how connected that person is to the Islamic aspect of what's going on there?
Ilyas, it's hard to say. Ilyas was Shamil's kind of chief of staff. I mean, just to use the word that I don't know. That's basically where he fell in the Shamil's line. But before 1999, Ilyas shows up in Azerbaijan as the foreign minister, wearing a suit, doing everything kind of like, here's how we do it in the West. And he's never been back into Chechnya as far as I know. So the break was somewhere between probably 98, 99, right in that period there. So the Russians say, hey, he's connected to Shamil, we want him. And he certainly was connected to Shamil. He was like his right-hand man for the better part of the First War and the better part of the Interwar period. It's hard, I don't know. I actually want to go out and talk to Ilyas and see what's going on. But I don't even know if he'll tell me. I don't know what his conditions are that he's here. I kind of thought the U.S. grabbed him because they just figured, what a great sense of intel to have the guy over here and tell us what's going on in Chechnya. But it's hard to say. He's never appeared, like Ilyas, you saw him in his uniform. He was very proud to be kind of a soldier, and he makes the point, he didn't ever want to be called a rebel, wanted to be called a soldier, things like this. But he never talked at all about Islam. It was never about Islam to him at that time, and I haven't seen him since, and I don't know.
Another question that's somewhat related. There's recent information that Zarqawi, for example, has not pledged allegiance to any great extent to Osama bin Laden. And that there are people saying that those who believe in the Islamic movement would give more to Zarqawi were he to pledge allegiance to Osama. Now, to what extent does Shamil connect with this pan-Islamic these pan-Islamic sentiments?
Well, that is the question. That's the $1 million question. Because I've read a lot in the press, and people are splitting hairs over where he falls on the Islamic barometer. It's hard to say. I do believe Shamil's very pragmatic. If you look at his war experience in Abkhazia and how he ran his troops there and how he ran his troops in the First War, he's probably one of the more pragmatic leaders. If you read Anatole Liebman's book, Chechnya, Tombstone of Russian Power, and Carlotta Gall, Thomas de Waal, they said that Shamil's probably one of the best, guerrilla commanders of the 20th century. There was a lot of praise for him on a military level, but again, it's before Islam came in. I don't know where he fits. I mean, his only real connection to the outside Islamic world was through Khattab, and Khattab, of course, was supposed to be connected to Osama, so he was connected, with a step or two removed. I don't think he ever traveled outside of Chechnya once the First War happened. I do know that he received money, but Shamil received money from everybody. Lukoil, apparently, paid the Chechens millions and millions of dollars during the First War to not hit any pipelines the two pipelines that ran through Chechnya. So the Chechens were on the Lukoil payroll during the whole First Chechen War. I mean, that's rumored. I don't have a memo that tells me that, but man, the Chechens, they drove some really nice SUVs and all kinds of stuff, and they were flush with cash, and the pipeline still had oil flowing in them in 1996, 97. So it's hard to say. Because I just used the money to sort of measure, and I was trying to figure out, money came from the UAE, it came from Saudi Arabia, but it came with these guys, Khattab. And Khattab was interesting. He was sitting in Shamil's father's house, he wouldn't talk to me, but he talked to my translator, who was a Muslim from Africa, an African Muslim. And he said, "Do you speak English?" And my translator said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "I hate these Chechens." He said, "Why?" He says, "They're the worst Muslims they're terrible Muslims. I hate them. All they want to do is fight and they want money. They want to fight and they want money. They don't understand the Quran. They don't understand Allah, you know." But he wouldn't say that in Russian, where the Chechens would understand him. And he actually told our interpreter, too, he said, "The Chechnya is a very strange place." He goes, "I come here as an Arab fighter, a missionary, and I have to fight all the time to prove my worth, or else I'm afraid the Chechens are going to kill me." And Khattab always had bodyguards in Chechnya just so he wouldn't get knocked off by other Chechens, or by Chechens. So I don't know. It's really strange. It's really strange. I have a really hard time sorting it out. You know, if you had a question. Okay.
Something you mentioned just a moment ago made me wonder. You said that with just a few fighters and a limited area, it's a wonder the Russians couldn't overcome their enemy. But is it possible that this war that benefits so many people, including Putin and his rise to power, is it possible that they've simply allowed it to go on to the point now that it's out of control? Have the Russians fomented or nurtured this war?
Well, you could argue they have on a lot of levels. Corruption in the Russian military was just unbelievable, and I owe all my travels in the Caucasus to corruption in the Russian military, because I've snuck through the Russian border. I've snuck through every single border in the South Caucasus through Russian command posts, usually for $5 or $10, $20. The individual Russian soldier doesn't care. And Russian soldiers, we saw on a very micro level, that's true. The fact that you can buy all the weapons you need from Russian troops, just then use them. On an official level, it's hard to say. I don't know. That's a really interesting question. You know, it is an interesting concept that, you know, the idea of why can't you get people on borders? You know, why can't you find Osama on the Afghan border? Or why can't you, you know, stop the Chechens coming through Georgia and Dagestan? And, you know, I don't know. But I've been on the border. It is porous. You know, it's hard. And like I say, I've snuck through every border there. So it's a good question. That's a really good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I guess the final comment before I close is that I'll just reiterate, if you take care of Basayev, if you take care of Muskatov, the war in Chechnya is not going to go away. And that's sort of the basic gist of it. I mean, you can put a $10 million bounty on Basayev, and if they collect him up this week, they will claim some sort of moral victory, of course, but it will not be the end of what's going on in Chechnya. It just won't. So, and I guess with that cheery thought, we'll leave you. So.